Betty Crocker's 1950s holiday cookbooks held 30 dessert recipes that were on every American table during the holidays, desserts so beloved that families would fight over the last slice.
And for a hot meal, without that warmed-over taste, how about hot lamb sandwiches?
But today, you won't find a single one of them at your family gathering. These aren't your typical Christmas cookies or pumpkin pie. These were elaborate, show-stopping desserts that cost less than $5 to make, took grandmothers hours to perfect, and tasted better than anything you can buy at a bakery today. They vanished from our kitchens, and we're about to bring them back. Let's start with the queen of Southern holiday desserts, Lane cake. If you've never heard of it, that's because it disappeared from holiday tables in the 1980s. But in the 1950s, this was the dessert you brought to impress. Lane cake is a 4-layer white cake with a filling that sounds absolutely wild. Egg yolks, butter, sugar, raisins, pecans, coconut, and a generous amount of bourbon. The alcohol doesn't cook off. This cake will give you a buzz if you eat enough of it. Emma Rylander Lane created this cake in Clayton, Alabama in the 1890s, and by the 1950s, Betty Crocker had included it in her holiday cookbook as a must-make. The cake took 3 hours to make from scratch. No box mixes allowed. Grandmothers would start baking Lane cake 2 days before Christmas, letting the bourbon soak into the layers overnight. The result? A cake so moist and rich that you could only handle a small slice. And that bourbon filling? It was basically liquid gold. But here's why it disappeared. Lane cake requires precision. The egg yolk filling has to be cooked on the stovetop without scrambling. The layers have to cool completely before assembly. One mistake, and the whole thing falls apart. Burnt sugar. That's the secret ingredient that made this pie the talk of every 1950s holiday party. Burnt sugar chiffon pie sounds intimidating, but it's actually one of the easiest pies Betty Crocker ever created, and one of the most dramatic. The filling is light, airy chiffon made with gelatin, egg whites, and caramelized sugar that's been cooked until it's almost, but not quite, burnt. The result is a pie with a deep, complex sweetness that tastes like caramel met coffee and decided to get married. In the 1950s, chiffon pies were everywhere. They were considered modern and sophisticated because they used gelatin, which was still a relatively new ingredient in home kitchens. Betty Crocker promoted chiffon pies as the perfect dessert for entertaining because they could be made a day ahead and stored in the refrigerator. Chiffon pie was the star of the chiffon family. It looked elegant with its cloud-like texture and tasted unlike anything else on the dessert table. Here's the process. You cook white sugar in a cast-iron skillet until it liquefies and turns amber. Then you very carefully add boiling water. It'll hiss and spit, and stir until the burnt sugar dissolves. This becomes the base of your chiffon filling. The burnt sugar flavor is smoky, bittersweet, and absolutely addictive, but this pie vanished in the 1970s when gelatin desserts fell out of fashion. People started associating gelatin with Jell-O molds and retro kitsch. Nestle Road pie is hands down the most extravagant dessert in Betty Crocker's 1950s holiday cookbook. It's a refrigerator pie with a filling made from chestnuts, maraschino cherries, rum, whipped cream, and candied fruit. In the 1950s, serving Nestle Road pie at your holiday party meant you had money and taste. This was a high-class dessert. It was fancy, it was expensive, and it was absolutely everywhere during the holidays. The name comes from Count Karl Nesselrode, a 19th-century Russian diplomat who supposedly loved chestnut desserts. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Nestle Road pie had become an American holiday tradition, especially in the Northeast. Betty Crocker's recipe called for candied chestnuts, which you could buy at specialty stores, along with rum extract and a graham cracker crust. The filling was a frozen chiffon mixture that tasted like Christmas in pie form, sweet, nutty, boozy, and studded with bright red cherries. If you've never had divinity fudge, you're missing out on one of the most unique candies ever created. It's not fudge in the traditional sense. It's actually a meringue-based candy made with egg whites, sugar, corn syrup, and vanilla. The texture is light, airy, almost cloud-like, but it holds together in firm squares. In the 1950s, divinity fudge was a holiday staple. Grandmothers would make massive batches and give them as gifts in decorative tins. It was the candy you brought to church potlucks, office parties, and family gatherings. Betty Crocker's divinity fudge recipe appeared in nearly every holiday cookbook she published in the 1950s. The recipe is deceptively simple. You boil sugar and corn syrup to the hardball stage, around 260 degrees Celsius. Then slowly pour it into beaten egg whites while mixing. The hot syrup cooks the egg whites and creates a glossy, marshmallow-like mixture. You pour it into a pan, let it set for a few hours, and cut it into squares. Some versions included chopped pecans or dried cherries for extra texture. Here's the catch. Divinity fudge is notoriously temperamental. It refuses to set if the humidity is too high. In the South, grandmothers would only make divinity fudge on dry winter days because summer humidity would turn it into a sticky mess. You also had to nail the temperature. Too low, and it wouldn't set. Too high, and it turned into hard candy. This finicky nature is exactly why divinity fudge disappeared. When easy-to-make fudge recipes using sweetened condensed milk became popular in the 1970s, families abandoned the more difficult divinity fudge. But here's the truth. When you make divinity fudge correctly, it's one of the best candies you'll ever taste. It's sweet but not cloying, light but satisfying, and has this incredible vanilla flavor that store-bought candy can't match. Scripture cake is the dessert that Sunday school teachers made for every church holiday party in the 1950s. Here's the gimmick. Every ingredient in the recipe corresponds to a Bible verse. Butter comes from Judges 5:25, flour from 1 Kings 4:22, eggs from Isaiah 10:14. The recipe doesn't list measurements directly. It gives you the Bible verses, and you have to look them up to figure out what goes into the cake. It was part baking project, part Bible study. Betty Crocker included scripture cake in her 1950s holiday cookbook with a twist. She provided both the Bible verse version and a standard recipe for people who didn't want to flip through their Bible while baking. The cake itself is a dense, spiced fruitcake loaded with raisins, figs, almonds, cinnamon, and cloves. It tastes similar to traditional fruitcake, but less boozy and more aromatic. In the 1950s, families would bake scripture cake in early December and let it age for a few weeks, wrapped in cheesecloth, soaked in brandy or apple juice. Scripture cake was popular because it combined two major aspects of 1950s holiday culture, Christianity and homemade baking. It was a conversation starter. You'd serve it at a party, and someone would inevitably ask about the name, which led to a discussion about the Bible verses. It was wholesome, it was festive, and it tasted good. So why did it disappear? Fruitcake fell out of favor in the 1980s and 1990s. It became the punchline of every holiday joke. Nobody actually eats fruitcake. By association, scripture cake got lumped into the fruitcake category and vanished. But here's the reality. Scripture cake, when made properly, is delicious. It's moist, flavorful, and has this deep spice profile that modern cakes lack. A loaf costs about $6 to make and feeds 12 people. It keeps for weeks in the fridge. And if you're hosting a church potluck or a family gathering with older relatives, bringing a scripture cake is an instant nostalgia hit. Betty Crocker's recipe still works perfectly. We're only 5 desserts in, and you're already seeing the pattern. Every single one of these recipes was a holiday tradition. Every single one disappeared, and every single one tastes better than what we're eating today. But here's where it gets wild. The next 5 desserts are even more forgotten and even more delicious. These are the desserts that only show up in handwritten recipe cards tucked inside old Betty Crocker cookbooks. If you've never heard of ambrosia torte or peppermint stick pie, you're about to understand why your grandmother's holiday table was better than yours. Ambrosia torte is what happens when you take the classic southern ambrosia salad, mandarin oranges, coconut, marshmallows, and whipped cream, and turn it into an actual layered cake. In the 1950s, this dessert was a showstopper. Betty Crocker's recipe called for a white cake base, sliced into 3 thin layers, then stacked with a filling made from fresh orange segments, shredded coconut, miniature marshmallows, and freshly whipped cream. The entire cake was frosted with more whipped cream and covered in toasted coconut. The result was a cake that tasted tropical, light and refreshing, completely different from the heavy chocolate and spice cakes that dominated holiday tables. Ambrosia torte was especially popular in the South, where ambrosia salad was already a holiday staple. The cake version elevated it into something elegant and special. Families would make ambrosia torte for New Year's Eve parties because the bright orange and white layers looked festive and celebratory. Ambrosia torte disappeared in the 1970s when whipped cream frosting fell out of fashion. Buttercream became the standard, and desserts with fresh fruit and whipped cream were seen as old-fashioned. By the 1980s, ambrosia torte had completely vanished outside of a few Southern families who kept the tradition alive. But this cake deserves to come back. It's easy to make. White cake from scratch takes about 30 minutes, and the filling is just assembling ingredients. A whole torte costs about $10 and serves 12 people. Compare that to a grocery store cake at $30 that tastes like cardboard. Peppermint stick pie was the dessert that turned candy canes into something spectacular. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe was simple but brilliant. Crush candy canes into fine pieces, fold them into whipped cream and melted marshmallows, pour the mixture into a graham cracker crust, and freeze it. In the 1950s, peppermint stick pie was a Christmas Eve tradition. Families would make it the night before Christmas and serve it after dinner. The red and white color scheme fit perfectly with holiday decor, and the frozen texture was a nice contrast to the heavy meals most families ate during the holidays. Kids especially loved peppermint stick pie because it tasted like candy. Peppermint stick pie disappeared in the 1980s when frozen desserts shifted toward ice cream-based pies. The marshmallow whipped cream combination fell out of favor, and peppermint became associated with cheap holiday candy instead of elegant desserts. By the 1990s, you couldn't find peppermint stick pie anywhere except in old Betty Crocker cookbooks. But here's the thing. This pie is still incredible. It's refreshing, it's festive, and it costs about $5 to make. A single box of candy canes, a bag of marshmallows, heavy cream, and a graham cracker crust. That's the entire ingredient list. Serve this at a modern holiday party, and people will ask for the recipe. Fruitcake has a terrible reputation, but fruitcake cookies, completely different story. Betty Crocker's holiday fruitcake cookies were small, chewy, spiced cookies loaded with candied cherries, pineapple, dates, and pecans. They tasted like fruitcake, but in a bite-sized, less intimidating form. In the 1950s, these cookies were everywhere during the holidays. Grandmothers would bake massive batches and pack them into decorative tins as gifts for neighbors, teachers, and postal workers. The secret to these cookies was the ratio of fruit to dough. Unlike fruitcake, which can feel like you're eating a loaf of candied fruit held together by a thin layer of cake, these cookies had just enough dough to hold everything together while still letting the fruit shine. They were chewy, not dry, sweet, but not cloying. And the spices cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, gave them a warm, complex flavor that tasted distinctly like the holidays. Betty Crocker's recipe also included a glaze made from powdered sugar and orange juice, which gave the cookies a glossy finish and an extra burst of citrus flavor. The glaze wasn't necessary, but it made the cookies look professional and bakery quality. Families would arrange them on platters and give them as gifts, and the cookies stayed fresh for weeks when stored in an airtight container. So why did they disappear? Same reason regular fruitcake disappeared: cultural backlash. By the 1980s, fruitcake had become a joke. TV shows and comedians made fun of it. The idea of eating candied fruit felt outdated. Holiday fruitcake cookies got lumped into that stigma and vanished. But that's a shame, because these cookies are genuinely delicious. They're not weird. They're not bad. They're just old-fashioned, and old-fashioned isn't a bad thing. A batch of holiday fruitcake cookies costs about $8 to make and yields around 60 cookies. You can't buy cookies this good at a store. Try them once, and you'll understand why grandmothers spent entire weekends baking these every December. Betty Crocker's recipe is foolproof. Snowball cake is exactly what it sounds like: a round cake covered in fluffy white coconut that looks like a giant snowball. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used a coconut cake base, moist, tender, and flavored with coconut extract, baked in a bowl-shaped pan to create a dome. Once cooled, the cake was covered in a thick layer of white frosting, usually cream cheese or buttercream, and then rolled in sweetened shredded coconut until every inch was covered. The result was a cake that looked like it belonged in a winter wonderland. In the 1950s, snowball cake was a centerpiece dessert. Families would place it on a cake stand in the middle of the holiday table, surrounded by evergreen branches and candles. It was dramatic, it was festive, and it tasted incredible. The coconut cake was rich and moist, the frosting was creamy, and the outer layer of coconut added texture and extra sweetness. The genius of snowball cake wasn't just how it looked, it was how forgiving the recipe was. If your frosting wasn't perfectly smooth, the coconut covered up any imperfections. If your cake dome was slightly lopsided, the coconut hid it. You could make a beautiful, impressive dessert without needing professional decorating skills. Snowball cake disappeared in the 1970s when elaborate cake decorating became trendy. Fondant, piping, and multi-tiered cakes took over, and simple cakes like snowball cake were seen as amateur hour. By the 1980s, it was completely gone from holiday tables. But here's the reality: most people don't have the time or skills to decorate fancy cakes. Snowball cake is approachable. It's easy. And it looks stunning without requiring any special equipment or training. A snowball cake costs about $12 to make, $8 for the cake ingredients, $4 for coconut. Compare that to a custom-decorated cake from a bakery, which runs at least $50. Betty Crocker's recipe is a winner. Mincemeat pie is probably the most controversial dessert on this list. People either love it or hate it. There's no middle ground. But in the 1950s, mincemeat pie was a Christmas tradition. Betty Crocker's recipe used store-bought mincemeat filling, a mixture of dried fruits, spices, suet, and sometimes brandy, baked into a flaky pie crust and served with hard sauce, a thick, buttery sauce made from powdered sugar, butter, and rum or brandy. The combination sounds odd if you've never had it, but here's what makes it work. The mincemeat filling is intensely spiced and sweet, with flavors of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and citrus. It's rich and dense. The hard sauce cuts through that richness, with its boozy, buttery flavor, and the contrast between the warm pie and the cold sauce is incredible. In the 1950s, mincemeat pie was considered an adult dessert because of the alcohol content. You didn't serve it to kids. You served it to adults after dinner with coffee or brandy. Mincemeat pie has a long history. It dates back to medieval England, where it was made with actual minced meat, hence the name. By the 1950s, most American versions used fruit and suet instead of meat. So why did mincemeat pie disappear? Two reasons. First, suet, beef or mutton fat, became increasingly hard to find in American grocery stores. Second, the name mincemeat confused people. Younger generations heard meat pie and assumed it was savory, which made them hesitant to try it. By the 1990s, mincemeat pie had almost completely vanished except in a few regions of the US and the UK. But if you can get past the name and the unusual ingredient list, mincemeat pie is one of the most flavorful desserts you'll ever eat. It's complex, aromatic, and unlike anything else on a modern dessert table. You can still buy jarred mincemeat online for about $8, and the pie costs about $12 total to make. Betty Crocker's hard sauce recipe is simple: butter, powdered sugar, and rum, and it takes 5 minutes. This is a dessert worth reviving, even if just for the novelty. 10 desserts down, 20 to go. And if you're starting to notice a pattern, you're right. Every single one of these desserts disappeared because we stopped valuing the time and effort they required. We traded craftsmanship for convenience. But here's the thing. These desserts aren't actually that hard to make.
The second dish of this demonstration is called cottage pie. We do start off rather as we did with the other one.
They just require a little patience. And the payoff? Desserts that taste better than anything you'll find at a modern bakery. The next 10 are even more obscure. These are the deep cuts, the desserts that even your grandmother might have forgotten. Black walnut cake is one of those desserts that tastes completely different from anything you've ever had. Black walnuts aren't the same as regular English walnuts. They have a much stronger, earthier, almost musky flavor that's incredibly distinct. In the 1950s, black walnut trees grew wild across the Midwest and South, and families would harvest the nuts in the fall, crack them open, which required serious elbow grease, and use them in holiday baking. Betty Crocker's black walnut cake was a 2-layer cake with a tender crumb, flavored entirely by the black walnuts folded into the batter. The frosting was a simple brown butter frosting that complemented the nutty flavor without overpowering it. The cake was dense but moist, and the flavor was sophisticated, not overly sweet, just rich and nutty with a hint of bitterness that made it feel grown up. In the 1950s, black walnut cake was a Thanksgiving and Christmas staple in rural areas where black walnut trees were common. Families would make this cake as a way to use up the nuts they'd harvested, and it became a regional tradition. The cake was also economical. Black walnuts were free if you foraged them, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Black walnut cake disappeared for one simple reason. Black walnuts became hard to find. As suburbs expanded and wild black walnut trees were cut down, fewer people had access to the nuts. Grocery stores didn't carry them because they were too niche. By the 1980s, black walnut cake had vanished outside of a few Midwestern and Southern families who still had access to the trees. But here's the good news. You can buy black walnuts online. They're expensive, about $15 a pound, but a little goes a long way. A single black walnut cake costs about $12 to make, and it's one of the most unique cakes you'll ever taste. If you want to serve something truly different at your holiday table, this is it. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple, and the flavor is unforgettable. Eggnog chiffon cake is the dessert equivalent of drinking eggnog, but better. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe took the flavors of traditional eggnog, nutmeg, vanilla, rum, and turned them into a light, airy chiffon cake. Chiffon cakes use oil instead of butter, which makes them incredibly moist and tender. The eggnog flavor came from actual eggnog folded into the batter, along with nutmeg and a splash of rum extract. In the 1950s, eggnog chiffon cake was a Christmas Day dessert. Families would make it on Christmas Eve and serve it after Christmas dinner with a dollop of whipped cream. The cake was tall and impressive. Chiffon cakes bake in a tube pan and rise dramatically in the oven. The texture was cloud-like, almost spongy, and the eggnog flavor was subtle but unmistakable. The brilliance of this cake was how it captured the essence of eggnog without being heavy or boozy. Traditional eggnog can be cloying and thick, but eggnog chiffon cake was light and refreshing. The nutmeg added warmth, the rum extract gave it depth, and the whipped cream topping made it feel festive. Eggnog chiffon cake disappeared in the 1970s when chiffon cakes fell out of fashion. Butter-based cakes became the standard, and chiffon cakes were seen as old-fashioned. By the 1980s, this cake was gone from most holiday tables. But chiffon cakes are incredible. They're lighter than butter cakes, they stay moist for days, and they're surprisingly easy to make. Eggnog chiffon cake costs about $8. $4 for eggnog, $4 for the remaining ingredients. Serve this at a holiday party, and people will ask, what makes it taste so good? The answer? Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe. Frango mints were a Chicago institution. These chocolate mint candies were originally sold at Marshall Field's department store, and they became synonymous with the holidays. In the 1950s, Betty Crocker created a brownie recipe that incorporated crushed Frango mints into the batter, creating a brownie that tasted like rich chocolate with a cool peppermint kick. The recipe was simple. Make a basic fudge brownie batter, fold in crushed Frango mints, bake until just set, and top with a peppermint glaze. The mints melted slightly during baking, creating pockets of gooey mint throughout the brownies. The peppermint glaze added an extra layer of flavor and made the brownies look polished and professional. In the 1950s, Frango mince brownies were a holiday party favorite, especially in the Midwest. They were easy to make, they traveled well, and they had that perfect combination of chocolate and peppermint that screamed Christmas. Families would bake them by the dozen and give them as gifts in decorative tins. Frango mince brownies disappeared when Frango mints themselves became harder to find. Marshall Field's was sold in the 2000s, and while Frango mints are still made, they're not as widely available as they once were. Without easy access to the candy, the brownie recipe faded into obscurity. But here's the thing, you don't need Frango mints to make this recipe work. You can use any chocolate mint candy, Andes mints, peppermint bark, even crushed candy canes mixed with chocolate chips. The concept is solid, and the brownies are delicious. A batch costs about $6 and makes 24 brownies. Betty Crocker's recipe is flexible and still works perfectly with modern ingredients. Cherry Winks are one of the cutest cookies you'll ever make. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe created a soft, chewy cookie loaded with chopped dates, pecans, and maraschino cherries, then rolled in crushed cornflakes before baking. The cornflakes created a crunchy exterior, while the inside stayed soft and tender. After baking, each cookie was topped with a quarter of a maraschino cherry, which gave them their wink. In the 1950s, cherry winks were a holiday baking staple. They were popular because they looked festive. The bright red cherry on top made them instantly recognizable as Christmas cookies. The flavor was unique, sweet from the dates and cherries, nutty from the pecans, with a hint of spice from cinnamon. The cornflake coating added an unexpected crunch that made them stand out from other cookies. Cherry winks were also practical. The dough could be made ahead and refrigerated for up to a week, which meant grandmothers could prep them early and bake them throughout the holiday season. The cookies stayed fresh for days when stored in an airtight container, and they shipped well if you wanted to mail them as gifts. So why did cherry winks disappear? Two reasons. First, dates fell out of favor in American baking. By the 1980s, dates were seen as old-fashioned, and younger bakers stopped using them. Second, maraschino cherries developed a bad reputation. They were associated with cheap, artificial desserts, and people stopped wanting them on their cookies. But cherry winks are legitimately good cookies. The dates add moisture and natural sweetness. The cherries add pops of color and flavor. And the cornflake coating is a brilliant textural element that modern cookies lack. A batch of cherry winks costs about $7 and makes 4 dozen cookies. Bread pudding was already a popular dessert in the 1950s, but Betty Crocker took it to the next level with date nut bread pudding. This wasn't your average bread pudding. The recipe called for stale date nut bread, a sweet, dense quick bread made with dates and walnuts, torn into chunks and soaked in a custard made from eggs, milk, cream, and vanilla. The result was a bread pudding that was rich, sweet, and loaded with chunks of dates and nuts. In the 1950s, date nut bread pudding was a way to use up leftover bread. Date nut bread was a popular quick bread that families baked throughout the year, and by the time the holidays rolled around, there was often a loaf or two that had gone stale. Instead of throwing it away, grandmothers would turn it into bread pudding and serve it with a bourbon sauce or vanilla ice cream. The beauty of this dessert was its versatility. You could make it ahead, refrigerate it, and reheat it before serving. You could serve it warm or cold. You could top it with whipped cream, caramel sauce, or hard sauce. It was a forgiving, adaptable dessert that always tasted good. Date nut bread pudding disappeared when bread pudding itself fell out of fashion in the 1980s. It was seen as a peasant dessert, something you made when you didn't have anything better. By the 1990s, most people had forgotten about it entirely, but bread pudding has made a comeback in recent years, showing up on restaurant menus at upscale prices. Date nut bread pudding is even better than standard bread pudding because the date nut bread adds so much flavor. You can make it for about $8, $4 for a loaf of date nut bread, $4 for the custard ingredients. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and foolproof. Ribbon fudge is a 3-layer fudge that looks as good as it tastes. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered chocolate fudge, vanilla fudge, and peanut butter fudge in a single pan, then cut them into squares once set. The result was a visually stunning candy with 3 distinct flavors in every bite. In the 1950s, ribbon fudge was a holiday gift favorite. Grandmothers would make massive batches, cut them into neat squares, and pack them into tins for neighbors, teachers, and co-workers. The candy looked professional and homemade at the same time, and the 3 layers made it feel special. The recipe was straightforward. Make 3 batches of fudge using the same base, sugar, butter, evaporated milk, but different flavorings: cocoa powder for chocolate, vanilla extract for vanilla, peanut butter for peanut butter. Pour each layer into a pan, let it set slightly, then pour the next layer on top. Once fully set, cut into squares. Ribbon fudge disappeared when easy-to-make fudge recipes using sweetened condensed milk became popular in the 1970s. The traditional cooked fudge method, which required a candy thermometer and precise timing, was seen as too difficult. By the 1980s, most people had switched to no-cook fudge, and ribbon fudge was forgotten. But here's the truth. Traditional cooked fudge is better. It has a smoother texture, a richer flavor, and it sets properly without being grainy. Ribbon fudge costs about $10 to make and yields around 60 pieces. You can't buy fudge this good at a store. Betty Crocker's recipe is worth the extra effort. Lady Baltimore cake. Lady Baltimore cake is the fancier cousin of Lane cake. It's a 3-layer white cake with a filling made from figs, raisins, pecans, and a hint of sherry, all folded into a fluffy white frosting. The cake is then covered in more white frosting and decorated with candied cherries or edible flowers. In the 1950s, Lady Baltimore cake was the dessert you served at weddings, anniversaries, and upscale holiday parties. The cake's name name comes from a novel published in 1906, where the protagonist falls in love after tasting Lady Baltimore cake at a tea room. By the 1950s, the cake had become a symbol of Southern elegance and hospitality. Betty Crocker's recipe stayed true to the original, with a delicate white cake base and a rich, fruity filling. The genius of Lady Baltimore cake was its balance. The white cake was light and tender, while the filling was dense and intensely flavored. The frosting, a boiled white frosting similar to marshmallow, was fluffy and not too sweet. Every bite had multiple textures and flavors: soft cake, chewy fruit, crunchy nuts, and creamy frosting. Lady Baltimore cake disappeared in the 1970s when elaborate cakes fell out of fashion. It was seen as too formal, too old-fashioned, and too labor-intensive. By the 1980s, it was gone from most holiday tables, but this cake deserves to come back. It's stunning. It's delicious, and it's not as hard to make as it looks. A Lady Baltimore cake costs about $15 to make. Most of the cost comes from the dried figs and pecans. But for a cake that serves 12 people and looks like it came from a professional bakery, $15 is a bargain. Betty Crocker's recipe is detailed and easy to follow. Penuche is a type of fudge made with brown sugar instead of white sugar, which gives it a deep, caramel-like flavor. Betty Crocker's penuche fudge recipe was a holiday staple in the 1950s, especially in New England, where penuche originated. The fudge was smooth, creamy, and had a butterscotch flavor that was less intense than caramel, but richer than regular fudge. The recipe was similar to other cooked fudge: brown sugar, butter, cream, and vanilla, cooked to the soft ball stage and then beaten until thick and creamy. The fudge was poured into a pan, allowed to set, and cut into squares. Some versions included chopped walnuts or pecans for added texture. In the 1950s, penuche fudge was a holiday candy table staple. It was less common than chocolate fudge, which made it feel special. Grandmothers would make both chocolate and penuche fudge to give variety on their candy platters. Penuche fudge disappeared when brown sugar candies fell out of fashion in the 1980s. Caramel became the dominant brown sugar flavor, and penuche was forgotten. Today, most people have never even heard of it, but penuche fudge is incredible. It's less sweet than chocolate fudge, with a complex molasses-like flavor that appeals to people who don't have a huge sweet tooth. A batch costs about $5 and makes around 40 pieces. Betty Crocker's recipe is straightforward and reliable. Sugarplum cake is one of the most festive-sounding desserts in Betty Crocker's 1950s holiday cookbook, and it lives up to the name. The cake is made with dried plums, prunes, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, then topped with a glaze made from powdered sugar and plum juice. The result is a dark, spiced cake that tastes rich and complex, almost like a gingerbread, but fruitier. In the 1950s, sugar plum cake was a Christmas Eve tradition. Families would bake it a few days before Christmas and let it sit, wrapped in foil, to allow the flavors to meld together. The cake improved with age. By Christmas Eve, it was moist, flavorful, and perfect for serving with coffee or tea. The name sugarplum comes from the Victorian era, when sugar plums referred to a variety of candied fruits and nuts. By the 1950s, sugar plums had become associated with Christmas, thanks to The Night Before Christmas, and sugar plum cake became a way to bring that nostalgic reference to life. Sugar plum cake disappeared when prunes became unfashionable. By the 1980s, prunes were associated with old people and digestive issues, and nobody wanted to eat a cake made with them. By the 1990s, sugar plum cake was gone, but prunes, rebranded as dried plums in recent years, are actually delicious in baking. They add natural sweetness, moisture, and a deep fruity flavor that raisins and dates can't match. Sugar plum cake costs about $8 to make and keeps for weeks. Betty Crocker's recipe is a hidden gem. Tom and Jerry pie is named after the Tom and Jerry cocktail, a hot eggnog-like drink spiked with rum and brandy. Betty Crocker's 1950s pie captured those flavors in frozen form. A graham cracker crust filled with a mixture of beaten eggs, sugar, rum extract, brandy extract, and whipped cream, then frozen until firm. The result was a pie that tasted like a boozy, creamy, slightly custardy dessert, perfect for New Year's Eve. In the 1950s, Tom and Jerry pie was an adult dessert. You didn't serve it to kids because of the alcohol. Even though the extracts were cooked, the flavor was distinctly boozy. The pie was light, airy, and refreshing, which made it a nice contrast to the heavy meals most families ate during the holidays. The pie was also incredibly easy to make. No baking required. Just mix the filling, pour it into the crust, and freeze. It could be made a day or two ahead, which made it ideal for holiday entertaining. Tom and Jerry pie disappeared when frozen desserts shifted toward ice cream-based pies in the 1980s. The egg and whipped cream filling fell out of fashion, and boozy desserts became less popular as attitudes toward alcohol changed. By the 1990s, Tom and Jerry pie was gone, but this pie is fantastic. It's light, it's boozy, it's festive, and it costs about $7 to make. If you're hosting a New Year's Eve party and want to serve something unique, Tom and Jerry pie is the move. Betty Crocker's recipe is perfect. 20 desserts down, 10 left, and we're getting into the truly obscure territory now. The desserts that even hardcore vintage baking enthusiasts might not know.
As it has been ever since they sat down to dinner in high chairs.
These are the recipes that were regional, the ones that only appeared in specific editions of Betty Crocker's Cookbook, the ones that required ingredients you can barely find today. But they're all worth making. Every single one. Let's finish strong. Jefferson Davis pie is a Southern classic that's basically a turbocharged chess pie. The filling is made from butter, sugar, eggs, dates, pecans, and spices, baked into a flaky pie crust until just set. The result is a pie that's sweet, gooey, nutty, and intensely rich. In the 1950s, this pie was a holiday staple in the South, particularly in Mississippi and Alabama, where it was named after the Confederate president. Betty Crocker's recipe for Jefferson Davis pie appeared in her 1950s Southern Edition cookbook, and it was one of the most requested recipes of the decade. The pie was simple to make. Mix the filling, pour it into a crust, bake for 40 minutes, but the flavor was complex. The dates added moisture and a caramel-like sweetness. The pecans added crunch, and the spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, added warmth. Jefferson Davis pie disappeared in the 1980s for two reasons. First, the name became controversial as awareness of the Civil War's legacy increased. Many bakers renamed it Southern Chess Pie or simply stopped making it. Second, dates fell out of favor in American baking, and without dates, the pie loses its signature texture. But if you can get past the name, or rename it yourself, this pie is incredible. It's one of the best chess pie variations ever created. A Jefferson Davis pie costs about $8 to make and serves 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is foolproof. Lemon chiffon icebox pie is the perfect summer-turned-winter dessert. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe took the bright, tangy flavor of lemon meringue pie and turned it into a light, airy chiffon pie that was served cold instead of hot. The filling was made from lemon juice, sugar, egg yolks, gelatin, and whipped cream, poured into a graham cracker crust and refrigerated until set. In the 1950s, lemon chiffon icebox pie was popular year-round, but it showed up on holiday tables because it was refreshing and light, a nice contrast to the heavy cakes, pies, and cookies that dominated dessert spreads. The pie was also easy to make ahead, which made it ideal for holiday entertaining. The genius of this pie was its texture. Traditional lemon meringue pie has a custardy filling topped with meringue, but lemon chiffon icebox pie folded whipped cream into the filling. which made it light and mousse-like. The gelatin helped it set without baking, and the graham cracker crust added a subtle sweetness and crunch. Lemon chiffon icebox pie disappeared when gelatin desserts fell out of fashion in the 1970s. By the 1980s, most people associated gelatin with Jell-O molds and retro kitsch, and chiffon pies got lumped into that category. But this pie is fantastic. It's refreshing, it's elegant, and it's easy to make. A lemon chiffon icebox pie costs about $6. Lemons, sugar, gelatin, graham crackers, and whipped cream. That's it. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and reliable. Everyone knows pineapple upside-down cake, but in the 1950s, apricot upside-down cake was just as popular. Betty Crocker's recipe used canned apricot halves arranged in a buttery brown sugar glaze at the bottom of a cake pan, topped with a simple yellow cake batter, and baked until golden. When flipped over, the result was a stunning cake with caramelized apricots on top. In the 1950s, apricot upside-down cake was a holiday brunch favorite. The apricots gave it a sophisticated, elegant look that pineapple couldn't match, and the flavor was less sweet and more complex. The brown sugar glaze caramelized during baking, creating a sticky, buttery sauce that soaked into the cake. Apricot upside-down cake was also practical. Canned apricots were cheap and available year-round, and the cake itself was foolproof. Even novice bakers could make a beautiful apricot upside-down cake. So, why did it disappear? Pineapple upside-down cake became the dominant version, and apricot upside-down cake faded into obscurity. By the 1980s, most people had never even heard of it. But apricot upside-down cake is better than pineapple. The apricots are less acidic, the flavor is more nuanced, and the presentation is more elegant. A cake costs about $9 to make. $5 for canned apricots, $4 for the remaining ingredients. Betty Crocker's recipe is a winner. Peppermint meringues are one of the simplest desserts on this list, but they're incredibly effective. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe made crisp, airy meringue cookies flavored with peppermint extract and studded with crushed candy canes. The meringues were baked at a low temperature until they dried out completely, resulting in cookies that were light as air and melted on your tongue. In the 1950s, peppermint meringues were a holiday staple because they were easy to make and incredibly cheap. Egg whites, sugar, and peppermint extract. That's the entire ingredient list. A batch cost less than $2 and made around 60 cookies. Grandmothers would make them by the dozen and use them to fill out holiday cookie platters. The beauty of peppermint meringues was their versatility. They could be piped into swirls, dropped into mounds, or shaped into wreaths. They looked elegant and festive, and they stored for weeks in an airtight container. They were also gluten-free and low-fat, which made them appealing to guests with dietary restrictions. Peppermint meringues disappeared when more elaborate cookies became trendy in the 1980s. Meringues were seen as too simple, too old-fashioned, and too plain. By the 1990s, they were gone from most holiday tables, but peppermint meringues are underrated. They're crisp, sweet, minty, and incredibly satisfying. A batch costs about $3 and takes 30 minutes of active work. Betty Crocker's recipe is foolproof. We've already talked about fruitcake, but Christmas fruitcake loaf deserves its own entry. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe was different from traditional fruitcake. It was lighter, less dense, and less boozy. The loaf was made with candied cherries, pineapple, raisins, dates, pecans, and a lightly spiced cake batter, then baked in loaf pans and glazed with a simple powdered sugar icing. In the 1950s, Christmas fruitcake loaf was a gift favorite. Families would bake multiple loaves, wrap them in festive cellophane, and give them to neighbors, teachers, and co-workers. The loaf was less intimidating than a traditional fruitcake. It looked like a quick bread, which made it feel more approachable. The flavor was mild and sweet, with just enough spice to feel festive. The candied fruit added pops of color and sweetness, and the glaze made the loaf look polished and professional. The loaf also stayed fresh for weeks, when stored in an airtight container, which made it practical for holiday baking. Christmas fruitcake loaf disappeared along with traditional fruitcake in the 1980s. The anti-fruitcake backlash hit everything with candied fruit, and this loaf was collateral damage. But Christmas fruitcake loaf is actually good. It's not dense or boozy. It's light, sweet, and festive. A loaf costs about $8 to make and feeds 12 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is straightforward and reliable. Maple walnut fudge is exactly what it sounds like. Fudge made with real maple syrup and loaded with chopped walnuts. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used pure maple syrup, butter, cream, and walnuts cooked to the soft ball stage and then beaten until thick and creamy. The result was a fudge with a deep, complex maple flavor and a satisfying crunch from the walnuts. The result was a fudge with a deep, complex maple flavor and a satisfying crunch from the walnuts. In the 1950s, maple walnut fudge was especially popular in New England and the Midwest, where maple syrup was produced locally. Families would make batches during the holidays and give them as gifts. The fudge was seen as a premium candy because pure maple syrup was expensive. It still is today. The genius of maple walnut fudge was its flavor. Maple syrup has a depth that white or brown sugar can't match. It's sweet, but also slightly smoky and earthy. Holiday trifle is a British-inspired dessert that became popular in America during the 1950s, thanks in part to Betty Crocker. The recipe layered cubes of sponge cake, or pound cake, with fruit, custard, whipped cream, and sherry, all assembled in a clear glass trifle bowl, so you could see the beautiful layers. In the 1950s, holiday trifle was a Christmas Eve dessert, elegant, impressive, and surprisingly easy to make. Betty Crocker's recipe used store-bought pound cake, instant vanilla pudding, canned fruit cocktail, and whipped cream, which made the trifle accessible for home cooks. The sherry was optional, but most families included it because it added a sophisticated flavor and a slight boozy kick. The result was a dessert that looked like it came from a fancy restaurant but required minimal effort. In the 1950s, holiday trifle was popular because it could be made ahead. You assembled it the night before, refrigerated it, and served it the next day. The flavors melded together overnight, and the cake soaked up the custard and fruit juices, which made every bite rich and flavorful. Holiday trifle disappeared when layered desserts fell out of fashion in the 1980s. It was seen as too fussy, too British, and too old-fashioned. By the 1990s, trifle was rarely seen outside of British households or specialty restaurants. But trifle is making a comeback. It's easy to make, it looks stunning, and it's endlessly customizable. You can use any type of cake, any type of fruit, and any type of liqueur. A holiday trifle costs about $12 to make and serves 12 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is a great starting point. Coconut snowballs are bite-sized, no-bake cookies that look like, you guessed it, snowballs. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined shredded coconut, sweetened condensed milk, powdered sugar, and vanilla, then rolled the mixture into balls and coated them in more shredded coconut. The result was a cookie that was sweet, chewy, and intensely coconut-flavored. In the 1950s, coconut snowballs were a holiday cookie tray staple. They were easy to make, no baking required, and they looked festive with their white, snowy appearance. Kids loved them because they were sweet and fun to eat, and adults appreciated how simple they were to prepare. The genius of coconut snowballs was their no-bake nature. During the busy holiday season, when the oven was constantly occupied with turkeys, hams, and pies, having a dessert that didn't require baking was a lifesaver. The cookies also stayed fresh for weeks when stored in an airtight container. Coconut snowballs disappeared when no-bake cookies fell out of favor in the 1980s. They were seen as too simple, too retro, and not impressive enough for modern holiday tables. By the 1990s, they were gone from most cookie platters. But coconut snowballs are delicious. They're sweet, chewy, and satisfying. A batch costs about $5 and makes around 40 cookies. Betty Crocker's recipe takes 15 minutes of active work. It's one of the easiest holiday desserts you'll ever make. Rum balls are the ultimate no-bake holiday candy. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used crushed vanilla wafers, powdered sugar, cocoa powder, chopped pecans, corn syrup, and rum, or rum extract, all mixed together and rolled into balls. The rum balls were then rolled in powdered sugar or cocoa powder to coat them. The result was a candy that tasted rich, boozy, and intensely chocolatey. In the 1950s, rum balls were a holiday gift favorite. They were easy to make, they traveled well, and they had a grown-up flavor that made them feel special. Grandmothers would make batches by the dozen and pack them into tins for neighbors, teachers, and co-workers. The beauty of rum balls was their simplicity. No baking. No candy thermometer. No complicated techniques. Just mix, roll, coat, and refrigerate. The rum added a boozy kick that made them an adult treat, but you could also use rum extract if you wanted a non-alcoholic version. Rum balls disappeared when boozy desserts became less popular in the 1980s. Attitudes toward alcohol in food changed, and many families stopped making desserts with liquor. We're ending with the most obscure dessert on this list, persimmon pudding. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used fresh persimmon pulp mixed with eggs, sugar, flour, milk, butter, and spices, then baked into a dense custard-like pudding. The result was a dessert that tasted sweet, spiced, and slightly tangy, unlike anything else on a holiday table. In the 1950s, persimmon pudding was a regional specialty, popular in the Midwest and South where wild persimmon trees grew. Families would harvest persimmons in late fall, mash them into pulp, and use them in holiday baking. Persimmon pudding was typically served with whipped cream or hard sauce. The flavor of persimmon pudding is hard to describe if you've never had it. Persimmons taste like a cross between a pumpkin and a date, sweet, slightly astringent, and intensely fruity. When baked into a pudding with cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, the result is a dessert that tastes deeply autumnal and comforting. Persimmon pudding disappeared because persimmons became harder to find. Wild persimmon trees were cut down as suburbs expanded, and grocery stores didn't carry fresh persimmons. By the 1980s, persimmon pudding was almost completely forgotten, but persimmons are making a comeback. You can find them at specialty grocery stores and farmers' markets in the fall. A persimmon pudding costs about $10 to make and serves 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is a hidden gem. If you can find persimmons, this pudding is worth making. 30 desserts. Every single one was a holiday tradition in the 1950s. Every single one has been forgotten, and every single one deserves to be on your table this year. These aren't just recipes. They're pieces of American culinary history. They're the desserts your grandparents made, the desserts that defined holidays for an entire generation. We traded them for convenience, for store-bought desserts that taste like cardboard, for pre-made cookie dough that has no soul. But here's the thing. These desserts aren't hard to make. They're not impossible. They just require a little time, a little effort, and a willingness to try something old-fashioned. And the payoff? Desserts that taste better than anything you'll find at a modern bakery. Desserts that will make your family ask, "Where did you learn to make this?" Desserts that will become new traditions. Betty Crocker knew what she was doing in the 1950s. These recipes have been tested by millions of home cooks over decades. They work, they're reliable, and they're delicious. So here's your challenge. Pick one of these 30 desserts and make it this holiday season. Just one. Try Lane cake, or burnt sugar chiffon pie, or peppermint stick pie. Bring it to your holiday table and watch what happens. People will be curious. They'll ask questions. They'll want the recipe, and you'll have brought back a piece of history that deserves to be remembered. These 30 desserts were forgotten, but they don't have to stay that way. Let me know in the comments which one you're going to try first. And if you want 30 more forgotten holiday recipes that Betty Crocker kept hidden in her vintage cookbooks, I'll see you in the next video. Happy baking!